March 26, 1945, Bad Nauheim, Germany. In a conference room a few miles from a line that was trying hard to be a line, General Omar Bradley sat with the small, steady machinery of warfare humming around him, maps pinned with colored thread, clerks shuffling reports, a phone with a patient ring. He had been on the line about fuel and rail schedules, the dull and necessary arithmetic of victory, when an operations officer burst in, face drawn, carrying a single sheet of paper. He laid it on the desk like a fuse. The report read like a mistake someone hoped to correct. Patton's Third Army had jumped forward 60 miles in one night. Pins that had been a narrow spear suddenly stuck into the map as if a man with a broom had swept the front forward. Bradley, listening to Eisenhower on the other end of the line, looked up and asked the question the rest of the war would boil down to. He's where? That question, simple, incredulous, a little frantic, wasn't rhetorical. For the next 6 weeks it would live in the corridors of Allied headquarters, in the tired faces of staff officers, in the clipped notes scrawled on briefing papers. It was the verbal shorthand for a paradox, spectacular momentum and total command dislocation, brilliance paired with a headache that could not be scheduled away. How did an army move so quickly that its own commanders lost track of it? The short answer is that Patton trusted speed. The longer answer is messy. Communications, logistics, personalities, and the strange arithmetic of operational momentum. In the first 24 hours after that position report, the map at Bradley's headquarters turned from tidy to chaotic. Position reports trickled in late, contradicted one another, and in several crucial cases were simply wrong. A recon pilot would call in a sighting of tanks near a village. An MP checkpoint would report a column moving the opposite direction. Radio traffic would trail actual movements by hours. A single night's 60-mile thrust had outpaced the relay of information. Relay stations, wire crews, radio batteries, all the things that turn motion into knowledge. Warfare depends on two parallel flows, physical movement and information. In a perfect world, they march in step. In practice, one can easily outrun the other. Patton habitually outran the information flow. Tanks and armored columns could physically cover ground faster than dispatch riders could ride, or radio nets could be reconfigured. Crews had to set up new relays, lay down fresh lines, redirect signal units. Every mile forward demanded a new string of logistics. Every hour forward required staff to spin their networks to keep the picture coherent. When Patton leapt, the staff picture snapped like a last, unsupported visual link. That first jump, 60 miles overnight, was the tip of the iceberg. Over the following days, reports painted a scattershot pattern across southern Germany.
Elements of Third Army were reported across some 80-mile arcs, in pockets and spearheads, some consolidated, some barely held together by momentum alone. One unit's morning position could be another's late afternoon ghost. Bradley's staff watched the map like people watching someone run a maze, and occasionally lift out of it into a parade ground, exultant and terrified at once. Communications alone did not explain the growing nightmare. Patton himself, relentless, impatient, always pushing, was stubborn about where he needed to be. He took personal reconnaissance in small vehicles, pushed forward in jeeps with a tiny escort, and worked with a single-mindedness that made staff procedures feel like advice meant for other people. Reconnaissance pilots and MPs saw flashes of the commander moving through forward areas. Sometimes they saw the jeep and the helmet and noted general passing through. Other times they saw boots and boots, a column of armor, and no commander in sight. The man who famously drove his army forward was not always where doctrine said a corps commander should be. For 3 days, 3 maddening days, Patton's exact location became a kind of administrative ghost story. Sightings were grainy, conflicting. One pilot reported seeing the Third Army spearhead near an industrial town. Another flashed a message that a unit was in a different sector entirely. Papers crossed headquarters late and without the fine print that made them useful. Bradley's operations officers, white-faced and almost bored from the strain, compiled lists of units and times and then crossed them out. How do you direct supplies to an army you cannot locate with precision? How do you coordinate artillery, liaison, and adjacent formations when the spear has no visible haft? The diplomatic dimension added a second urgent color to the problem. The Soviets were advancing from the east. Allied leaders were painfully aware of demarcation lines and the political risk of bumping into an ally that was not yet an enemy. If Patton's speed carried him to Soviet-held sectors, or dangerously close, the consequences could be more than operational. They could be diplomatic, explosive even. Eisenhower, who had to juggle not only military outcomes but coalition politics, watched the situation with growing alarm. Here was a general who could win ground fast, yes, but also a general whose speed threatened to outrun the careful, negotiated choreography of the closing months of the war. So the map was messy, communications lacked, diplomatic constraints lingered like a distant thunder. And then Patton, notoriously impatient about being told what to do, outdid even his own reputation. He became effectively unfindable. Unfindable doesn't mean invisible. It means that the usual channels by which a headquarters keeps contact, dedicated liaison units, scheduled radio check-ins, the informal network of hearsay among MPs and pilots, failed to give a single reliable fix.
Officers at Bradley's headquarters compiled logs of sightings. A reconnaissance plane glimpsed a staff car near a crossroads. A column radioed in from a town that would vanish from reports 2 hours later. A jeep with a familiar helmet swept past a checkpoint, and no one could say where it had come from or where it would go next. For days, Patton was a forward-moving rumor, a presence that could not be pinned. There's an odd human element in that. Staff officers in quiet rooms, staring at maps and feeling responsible for men and material they could not see. Bradley, whose style leaned toward the patient and methodical, found himself caught between admiration and an administrative panic. He had to account for supply convoys, ammunition dumps, fuel pipelines. Orders without location are like recipes without quantities. They are gestures but not plans. At times, the situation produced absurd little scenes that warmed with the dark humor only a stressed staff can appreciate. An operations officer would hold up a sheet, point to a cluster of unit stamps, and joke, barely, that the map looked like a shotgun blast. Another would mutter that every position report seems 6 to 12 hours behind. Those jokes counted for something. They were a pressure valve for men who could not stop thinking of what would happen if a supply column missed a rendezvous by a single day. Patton's style exacerbated the problem. He was the kind of commander who trusted the feel of advance more than the tick of a clock. He moved to contact, kept moving, and then moved some more, rarely waiting for the painstaking assembly of logistics to catch up. That dissonance was not purely tactical, it was personal. His chief of staff, Hobart Gay, and others tried to thread the needle between obedience and the practicalities of keeping an army fed and moving. MPs and recon pilots contributed fragments of location, sometimes credible, sometimes merely hopeful. Together, those fragments were not enough. And then the climax, the call that lands like a shot. Bradley finally gets Patton on the line, or rather, he hands Patton Eisenhower's line. The conversation that followed was not a clean transcript. It was a compressed, furious exchange, a collision between two styles. Eisenhower needed to enforce coordination. He needed to know where units were to prevent friendly incidents and political embarrassment. Patton, with the air of a man who had already seen the terrain from the front and decided on its contours, answered with the confidence of someone living in motion. He reported gains, described dispositions, and in doing so combined an unapologetic impatience with an implicit promise: we are getting results. The essential drama of that moment was not lack of competence, it was mismatched priorities. Eisenhower's phone call carried the weight of coalition command and the calculus of larger strategy. Patton's responses carried the weight of immediate tactical opportunity.
Bradley, stuck between them, felt the wrench of both. He listened, tried to reconcile the reports, and repeated like a refrain the question that had started it all. He's where? What came next was an ugly, brilliant truth. Patton's gamble paid off. Third Army rolled forward with a ferocity that took Germans by surprise and seized cities ahead of schedule. Nuremberg fell in that stretch, a symbolic and operational prize. In 6 weeks, Third Army covered roughly 300 miles, an extraordinary distance in that phase of operations, particularly given the fractured communications and the damaged transport infrastructure of late-war Germany. Casualties were, in many cases, lower than the worst forecasts predicted. Where some had feared a costly slog, momentum delivered surprisingly clean victories. And yet the gains came at a cost that was not always measured on casualty rolls. Supply lines were stretched thin. Forward units lived perilously close to running out of fuel, ammunition, or the simple necessities needed to keep men and machines going. There were moments of moral hazard, where a commander's personal boldness forced staff officers to invent solutions on the fly. There were diplomatic frictions, some avoided, some only barely step-stepped. The very speed that made the victories possible also multiplied points of failure. It was a paradox, genius and danger braided together. Bradley's reaction through all of this is instructive. He was not a man prone to theatrical outbursts. He was a practitioner of steady command. Yet he could not help a tone of wry, exhausted admiration when he recounted Patton's feats. The phrase that stuck, his incredulous "he's where," became shorthand not simply for a geographic surprise, but for Patton's whole mode of warfare. Bradley did not celebrate recklessness. He understood it as a trade-off. Let a maverick run, and you may get faster victory. Restrain him, and you may forestall disaster. That binary was no comfort. He had to manage the risk without smothering the advantage. Patton himself, for his part, rarely framed his actions as reckless. He saw himself as seizing terrain and opportunity, seeing what he needed to see. When questioned later, his explanations were succinct and practical. Go forward, take advantage, do not waste time. Whether that approach was noble or foolhardy is less interesting than the results it produced and the dilemmas it forced on the Allied command. He achieved extraordinary operational reach. He also made life miserable for the men who had to make the paper world conform to the physical one. One episode crystallizes the oddness of the era. There were times when reconnaissance pilots would report seeing the Third Army spearhead, and within that spearhead, the general himself, at a point nearly 200 miles ahead of what earlier reports had shown as the front.
That figure, 200 miles, appears in contemporary chatter and later retellings, and it drove home the scale of Patton's advance. But the exact distance, in some sources, is marked as indefinido. Records, bureaucratic afterthoughts, and the fog of late-war reporting leave parts ambiguous. The larger truth remains clear. Patton was astonishingly far forward, far enough to make Bradley and Eisenhower put down their pencils and pick up the phone. If you like this kind of military deep dive, hit subscribe to follow this series. The narrative that followed the shock of discovery had its own rhythm. Staffs learned to improvise. Supply officers rerouted convoys through night marches. Signal units worked grueling schedules to reestablish radio nets. Liaison officers rode rough roads trying to catch up with a commander who kept moving. Where doctrine suggested consolidation before the next push, Patton preferred to keep the pressure on. And those who tried to marry both aims, force and control, found themselves stretched thin, righteous in duty and exhausted in execution. There were brief, almost comic reversals. A supply convoy meant for one division would arrive to find the division 2 towns farther on. A local town assumed liberated would suddenly host an armored column in the wrong direction. Sometimes these mistakes corrected themselves. Sometimes they produced critical delays. The human element, clerks, truck drivers, radio operators, became the unsung, frayed sinew holding the advance together. The months of March to May 1945 were a study in contrasts. On paper, the Allied effort was an exercise in planning, logistics, and coalition management. In the field, it was improvisation, opportunism, and the raw courage of men closing with an enemy that was increasingly disintegrating. Patton embodied the latter. Bradley embodied the former. Both were necessary. Both were exasperating to the other. When Patton finally re-established consistent communication and began to appear on maps with reliable pins, the operational picture smoothed out, but not entirely into complacency, and the strategic consequences were mixed. Cities were taken, whole sectors collapsed, and the end of the German war came sooner than many had once feared. Yet along the way, the Allied leadership had to balance praise and censure. Eisenhower, forced to do the ledger of both outcomes and infractions, alternated between angry phone calls and a grudging, almost amused recognition that a man who drove his army so hard was also one more reason the Germans were losing. What then is the lesson of that spring sprint? The immediate takeaway is tactical. Momentum can yield decisive advantage. But the more interesting lesson is organizational and moral. An organization tolerates a maverick when the maverick delivers, but toleration is not the same as control. The command structure inevitably must absorb the consequences of a leader who refuses to be bound by its processes.
Bradley's repeated "he's where" conveys not only surprise, but also a weary admission. Sometimes you do not choose the battles you command. They choose you. Leadership in this story is not a simple moral test. It is a negotiation between ends and means. Patton pursued ends with relentless energy. Bradley sought means that made those ends sustainable. Both aims had legitimacy. Both threatened to undermine the other. The result was an uneasy coexistence, friction, improvisation, exasperation, and ultimately, victory. The image that lingers is almost cinematic. A map with pins like a star field, a phone that never fully stops ringing, a general in a jeep bumping along dirt roads while his staff in a warmer room attempts to stitch together the thin human threads of supply and intelligence. The war's end came not because one style was superior, but because in the cruel arithmetic of 1945, audacity and administration combined in a way that broke the enemy. Bradley's final appraisal, worn, wry, realistic, captures the ambiguity. No one truly lets Patton do anything, he seemed to say. Instead, they hang on, manage what they must, and hope the momentum kills the enemy before it kills them.
That phrase, equal parts admiration and exasperation, is a reasonable epitaph for the campaign. Pay attention to audacity when it wins, but do not be surprised when you must pay to make it safe. So what happened when Patton surprised Bradley 200 miles from the front? The short version: a commander pushed his army faster and farther than the usual machinery of information and supply could track. Headquarters scrambled, diplomacy tensed, and the result, messy as it was, delivered decisive gains. The longer version is a study in trade-offs. The momentary freedom of a bold leader can yield rapid success, but it forces a bureaucracy into emergency management. The price of genius is ongoing risk. The story does not end in clear moral victory or simple condemnation. It ends with a sober human insight. War, especially in its last furious months, rewards speed, but it does not absolve irresponsibility. It rewards boldness, but also taxes prudence. In the quiet that follows the noise of advance, commanders count the gains and the costs and ask themselves whether the trade was worth the risk. Bradley's persistent, incredulous question, "He's where?" is the question every commander must ask when facing a maverick in motion. You owe the audacity in front of you a supply line, a diplomatic plan, and a staff that can sleep at night. You also owe it the humility to admit that on the battlefield, sometimes the man who drives forward will take you somewhere you did not expect, and sometimes, if luck holds, that is exactly where victory lies. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a decisive moment of World War II, like and subscribe, and check out our next episode on Patton's leadership style and its consequences in the closing months of the war.